Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Alison Bailey. Dr. Bailey is a professor of philosophy at Illinois State University, the director of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. Her scholarship engages feminist theories, philosophy of race, and critical whiteness studies. Today, she's here to discuss her current book, The Weight of Whiteness, Feminist Engagements with Privilege, Race, and Ignorance. Dr. Bailey invites whites to wade slowly and mindfully into the inherited weight of whiteness and recognize how white supremacy anesthetizes white people from their own humanity. Welcome, Dr. Bailey.
It's a joy to be here. Thank you for having me.
I think we probably should start with what the title of the book suggests. What is the weight of whiteness? How should we understand that?
Well, I've been teaching race and philosophy for a very long time. And one of the things we always start with is this metaphor that's been made famous by Peggy McIntosh about an invisible and weightless knapsack. So this is something that W.B. Du Bois talked about a very long time ago, but McIntosh's metaphor is very, very tenacious. And so students, when they unpack the knapsack, they talk about the privileges that white supremacy gives white people, like the public trust and being able to find products in stores that accommodate you. But there's a weightless part of the knapsack that she never discusses. And so I became very, very curious about just why that knapsack felt weightless to a lot of white students, because it's filled with all kinds of wild cards, get out of jail free cards, passports, visas that facilitate white people's movement through the world. So what is this weight, and why does it feel weightless? And I started reading some of the things that African American scholars and activists had said about whiteness, and came to the conclusion that part of this is that we don't feel the weight because we are anesthetized to it.
How does that anesthetization occur? What creates that? I mean, when you think of a doctor, you're getting an operation, you're going to get a shot, and then you're not going to feel the pain, you're not going to be aware of things that are happening.
Yeah.
What is the social or cultural basis for us being anesthetized to race?
Right. Well, this goes back quite a ways. So I always go back to James Baldwin, The Price of the Ticket, right, is the loss of our humanity. So when you lose your humanity, you break human connections. You don't empathize with people. You fail to see the suffering in others. You become disinterested. And I think the homeless, people that are unhomed, are a good barometer of our humanity. And think about how many of us walk by, and the first thing we say is, well, they must have done something wrong, they must be addicted, and we always blame them for their condition. And when we do that, we lose a piece of our humanity because we are distancing ourselves from their suffering. So that's a very scary thing, right? That we can walk by someone who's suffering and not acknowledge or attend to them or see them as someone who needs our support, or just, are you okay?
Well, does that when you say distancing, I immediately think of Americans being distanced from most of the wars, because you don't see the war, you don't feel the war, you might see it in the media, or even distance from segregated communities. So you're distanced from knowing what the black community, because I mean, even in Chicago, it's highly segregated. So if you're white, you live in Ukrainian Village or the North Side or somewhere else. So your distance, does that contribute to this? I don't know if that's...
and this is part of ignorance, right? This is part of willful ignorance on the part of a lot of white people, is we don't know and we don't want to know. So segregation and redlining, I think, are really good examples of anesthesia, because they literally break connections between communities. And historically, they've done that. So white ignorance is that you don't leave places where you're comfortable.
And if I go to get a bank loan, for instance, I'm unaware of the fact that I'm apt to get the bank loan with a certain income, a certain credit rating, but I'm not aware that a black applicant with the same credit rating, the same income, is likely to be denied. But I'm not aware of that, so that's one of the things that distances me. It seems like everything is up and above board, and if they didn't get the loan, it must have been because they weren't qualified, but there's a separate standard.
Yeah, And part of that anesthesia, there's a very strong epistemic component, which epistemology is just a fancy title for what philosophers call theory of knowledge.
Yep. How do we know this?
Right, how do we know this? So the interesting thing about whiteness, and this is from Charles Mill's work, is that we learn to see the world wrongly. So when you go into the bank and you get your loan and, you know, a Latinx person comes in and applies for a loan and you're thinking, well, you know, they must have done something wrong to not get the credit. And so you see the world wrongly. You fail to see that
you're only seeing it from your perspective?
Yes, and you assume that everybody has the privileges that you have, right? And that's not always the case. So one of the things I try to do in the book to talk about this weight is to be very vulnerable and candid about the way it shows up in our bodies, including my own body. So think about how the weight and the ignorance shows up when white people walk by a number of Latinx men at a bus stop and they see a gang and not people going to work, right? The inference to the best explanation is they're going to work or they're going to school. Or if you walk by someone, a person of color in a supermarket who's locked out of their car and you say, oh, you know, they're trying to break into the car. No, they're blocked out of their own car, right?
Right.
So we constantly see the world wrongly. And that's part of the anesthesia and part of our willful ignorance, that we don't attend to things that on face value are just obvious.
I wonder if part of that is learned behavior, though.
Oh, it's very much learned behavior.
I mean, because I was in Cuba and I asked some Cubans the same question because there were like a half a dozen black Cubans coming and nobody was dismayed. And I asked them that question and used Chicago as an example. And it never crossed their mind because they had not learned to make an identification of a certain skin color with a certain behavior or a certain risk. So. Yeah. I read your book thoroughly, and I have some quotes that I took from the book, and I thought it would be helpful if you could explain some of these or expand on them, I guess. So you write that whiteness, or operating as if the customs, culture, and beliefs of the white racialized identity function as the standard by which all other groups are measured. You say it has a gravitational pull that draws white people away from feeling the damaging effects of white supremacy. So how does that whiteness pull us away from recognizing white supremacy?
Okay, that's a long, complicated answer, but let's come at it this way. One of my challenges in this book to my readers, who I'm assuming a white audience, is to get them not only to see what they can't see, like privilege, but to get them to feel what they can't feel. And so one of the difficulties with that is how whiteness continues to keep taking back the center. And so it's always back to us, back to our feelings. And the way we anesthetize ourselves to feeling the weight of whiteness, one pretty common habit is what scholars have called white talk. So, ask folks of color about this and they'll always tell us, we hear this stuff all the time, but white people will constantly say things like, well, I marched in the Not in Our Town rally, my ancestors never owned slaves, we weren't around for the Indian Removal Act, things like that. And when we do that, we reorient ourselves to our goodness, our innocence, and our comfort. So it's a discursive strategy that pulls us back to like a terrain where we feel at home, we feel good, we feel affirmed. But we don't want to upset that terrain, so we're persistent. But whiteness has a gravitational pull. It pulls us towards safety, it pulls us toward comfort, it pulls us towards suburbs.
My son talked about that very thing, and he said that what he saw was the attempt to deny what might have been or not been in the past or your past is largely irrelevant, because if we talk about today, 2022, you have to talk about segregated education, you have to talk about unequal health care, the court to prison system. So it's not it's not sufficient to say, well, I wasn't here for that, and I'm not responsible for that. The question is, are you responsible for what is now?
Right.
How do you feel what is
Yeah.
now? How do you get to that? One of the things that struck me is your book, it's gentle. It seems like it's written for white people and kind of coming at it in a very comforting way. I mean, you're asking almost like I don't want to say, almost like a therapist to say, well, tell me how that's working for you, which is kind of the feeling I get from this. So, and at one point you say the weight of whiteness is at root psychological, which I think is part of why I read this as gentle, almost therapeutic to deal with. In another spot, you'd call it white trauma. So,
yeah, this is a very delicate conversation to have because it's misunderstood. As soon as you say white supremacy hurts white people too, people hear it as it's equal, and it's not.
yeah.
But a lot of African American scholars like James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, other folks have talked about, white people need to work on their own stuff.
Yep.
Because I think about the ways that white folks show up in political movements for folks of color, and it's often with this intention of rescue or goodness.
Yeah.
And it's what can we do?
White man's burden.
White man's burden. Well, not white man's burden. That's sort of a different, a different showing up. But they're conceptually linked because they're talking about saving and rescuing and stuff. And one of the things I've come to see is that the violence of white supremacy will continue as long as white people are anesthetized enough not to work on ourselves. So part of that political movement has to be a deep understanding of how white supremacy has disfigured and contorted white identities enough that we continue to blow our historical trauma and our personal trauma through communities of color. And that's a profound, difficult thing to see, but I mean it in the most gentle way. Like, I think white people, we need to slow down and listen to what our bodies have to tell us about how we react to simple requests to show up for folks of color in ways that matter.
So the question is for me and for whites that come to that recognition, what do you do about that? It's right. I mean, it seems to me that resistance has to go beyond being sensitized to whiteness. It has to go beyond that so that you actually address racism rather than the white pain of racism.
Right.
Right. So supporting things like affirmative action or reparations or school desegregation or funding school desegregation.
Right.
Those would be things. Even if somebody is still contorted in their body, if they take those actions, they're creating a culture and social relations that for everybody that lives in that new environment, they will be learning something different than what I might have learned or you might have learned here. So it seems like to becoming sensitized to that white privilege, that's fine. But now what do you do about it? You actually have to take a position on A, B, C, or D, and if those things are successful, you've changed the environment that has created that very condition of the weight of whiteness, if that makes any.
Yeah, it does, and I don't think we're talking cross purposes or anything because this is not an either-or kind of conversation. It's not like you do the work, you do the psychological work, or you do the movement work. I think where we overlap on this is what I'm concerned about in the book is how white people show up in those movements in ways that are productive, kind, and attentive. And I've been in a lot of movement politics as well, and I've witnessed myself and other white folks show up in ways that are actually harmful to the communities they're trying to support. So part of the WAIT project for me is getting white folks to settle, focus, and become mindful of some of the things that that are in our bodies that do damage to us and prevent us from showing up for folks of color in ways that are helpful, kind, loving, and supportive.
That means white people need to walk into the places that scare them and explore the clean pain required for collective liberation. So
that's exactly it, yes.
One of the questions that rises is whose liberation is at issue here?
Liberation is collective. We can't do this without one another. So let me give you a simple example that's kind of non-racial and non-systemic. Suppose, for the sake of argument, you and your partner were in couples counseling, and your partner shows up and says, you know, I'll support you, I'll come to your rallies, I'll help with the social media, but you know, I just don't want to work on myself. You know, I'm not going to do that work on my anxiety or my depression. I'm just going to, I'll just, you know, show up for you. That alliance is not going to last. So part of my metaphor here is that white people in our own time and our own spaces need to be working on this so we show up in ways that are helpful. Otherwise, we're going to be a mess. And that relationship's not going to work. And our collective humanities in the liberation is tied in with each another, with our histories, with our ways of being with one another, with our concerns.
I understand that. It makes a lot of sense. My tendency is to think about, well, what do I do when I get to that point? You talked about Menachem, and in the book you quote him. He says that clean pain mends and builds capacity for growth, so you know what to say or do, and then you do it. Your description didn't quite get to the do part. Your description says it's a pain that forces you to stop, observe, breathe, and settle.
Yes.
Do you get to the do part? Menachem says it builds a capacity for growth, so you know what to say or do, and you do it even if it's uncomfortable. You don't have to resolve your comfort. You can be working on yourself. You don't have to get that resolution that you're looking for. You have to do something about it, is what Menachem is saying. So is that something that you're agreeing?
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely. So maybe let's go back to his the distinction he uses between clean and dirty pain, because what this does is tell us that there's two ways of dealing at what Du Bois calls the wound at the heart of whiteness. You can medicate it endlessly and then blow your trauma through other people, or you can sit with that pain until it's gone and you can show up for people in ways that are helpful. So what clean pain does is it's the pain you feel when you have to do something, but you don't want to, and you keep putting it off, and you keep procrastinating. So you have to give bad news to someone, or break up with someone, or give bad news to your neighbor or something, and it festers, and it consumes you, and it focuses on you. Dirty pain is. No, I'm sorry, that's dirty pain.
Yeah, because I was going to say the next step would be you get there, but then you do it. You don't just stay in the festering level.
Right, so let me just backtrack. I explained dirty pain, my apologies. So that dirty pain keeps you focused on yourself and the constant anesthesia you need to get through the day. Clean pain is a liberatory pain that allows you to walk into the places that scare you, and when you're called out on stuff, you just acknowledge it and you sit with it and you move through it, and then you'll have more energy to expend on the sorts of projects you mentioned. Yeah. But white people, we constantly contort ourselves with the white talk and the excuses and the I'm a good ally and stuff, and it doesn't allow us to connect to other people when we do that.
Yeah, I guess I'm also looking for the connection between white healing and what will actually solve the actual physical, economic, psychological pain of Black America or Mexican America, right? So white healing, from my perspective, is not my primary interest. Fix yourself. My primary interest is having equality, ending police violence, stopping the attacks on immigrants, right? And if that means someone's still in pain just because they don't like that the laws have been changed, well, my feeling is as you have those laws change and people begin to function in ways different than they did a generation before, you're going to have a whole different psychological learning. It's different learning because people will learn that Black people aren't a threat to them. Why? Because they're working in the same place, they're going to the same schools. It's, you have to create the climate that makes possible a different psychology. Staying in that climate and resolving it would be like somebody that does go to therapy and works on themselves, but goes back to the same job or back to the
Yeah,
same kind
yeah.
of relationship, and
Uh-huh.
they're creating the same conditions. So
Right.
I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I'm
No, I'm just, I think these concerns are concerns I share, but my book sort of grabs a different corner of the conversation because it's not a book on politics and stuff. And I do have a lot of examples about movement politics and things in there, but I'm trying to make this weight visible here. And then perhaps another project would be to think about how it works on the streets and in movements. Because a lot of the work I've done has been with folks in movements on just being embodied in ways that are gentle and help us show up for one another.
Well, I don't mean to say that you
Yeah.
don't do that, because you do have examples
Yes.
of activities and actions. And,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things that you keep coming back to is how things such as white talk can shut down important conversations.
Yeah.
So if we're having a conversation about how do we address school desegregation or police violence, if it stays at the level of white talk, it's not.
There we go.
It's
Yes.
not gonna. It's not gonna. You're not gonna be able to proceed to what can or should be done, because it's like, well, he probably deserved it because he was probably a criminal anyway. Like kind of happened with many of the shootings. The justification comes from, well, you don't know what he was like before the cops showed up. So,
Yeah.
and that's kind of what I see as white talk that interferes with
Good. Yes.
recognition of what is and what we have to address, even if it makes someone uncomfortable, I guess.
Yeah, and that's what about the showing up is, because if we keep anesthetizing ourselves with white talk, it's about us. Yeah.
So let's bring this back around to what we
Okay.
started with white supremacy. And obviously it lives in the psychology of whites and in our bodies. But it also lives in the world in which we live, which is how I would argue that it enters into our psychology
Yes.
in our bodies. Because as I think you said, or I said, we both said, the courts, the realtors, the banks, offices, police tasers, and guns are all physical manifestations of white supremacy. We may not experience that because our spaces are different.
Yes.
So the connection from recognizing white supremacy and coming to grips with that and going through the pain of that has to happen first, or can that happen simultaneously with addressing these other questions that exist for our black citizens, our Mexican American citizens, our Muslim citizens? Can they happen simultaneously?
They have to happen in conversation with one another, because they go hand in glove with one another, right? Black folks, Latina, immigrants, Muslims feel the weight of whiteness every day.
Yes.
And every movement they make.
Yes.
They understand that white people are hypervigilant. They have to navigate our gazes, our spaces.
So the weight of whiteness doesn't just get carried by whites. It
No,
gets
no.
carried by everybody in a white
Yes.
society.
Yeah, and so the first part of my book, I talk a little bit about, white people, if they don't want to take up the weight, can they attend to its imprint on communities of color?
Yeah, because our weight may be invisible or weightless, but their weight is
They feel it every day. Every day.
heavy.
And it's crushing,
Yeah.
right? Think about some of the examples I gave of just routine traffic stops and black women going to the hospital who know something is wrong with their body but are not heard. Yeah. Or George Floyd feeling the weight of Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck, a physical way of weight.
That's a weight. The weight of whiteness comes in a different way.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
So-
the discomfort that whites may feel with something that's a weightless weight, it seems comparatively, although psychologically it may be difficult, but comparatively to the weight that others bear, it seems a reasonable request to address this weight.
Well, the pressure comes from somewhere, right? The hypervigilant white gaze just doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from unsettled white bodies that have been raised in ways to think of black and brown people as interlopers or strangers.
Yeah.
But
Well,
we're numb to that.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey. We could have I'm sure we could
I would
continue
love
this
that.
conversation for a long time.
Yes.
But that's all the time we have on the program today. Thanks to Dr. Bailey for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.